Um, Hello, I'm Justin Childress. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the Master of Arts and Design and Innovation program here at SMU. Our program is a 2-year full-time graduate program in human-centered design, and we believe that the methods and the mindsets of design can be used in any field. So this classroom, the classroom that we teach in, is a little bit different than some of the ones that we've been talking about so far. But I do give a lot of talks, but since I'm a designer, most of my talks are about design. I went to design school twice and teaching school 0 times. So it's easy for me to be a little bit intimidated by the possibility that everyone here is already doing some version of what I'm about to talk about, and I'm just sort of late to that pedagogical party. But I'm going to try to frame that vulnerability as productive because it motivates me to consolidate and share a concrete version of what I've been doing around student seminars the last couple of years, so that afterwards I can learn from you about what you've been doing outside of my little bubble of design education. For the purpose of this conversation, I'm defining student-led seminars as a full class session facilitated by a small team of students assigned in advance, responsible for planning the flow of discussion, guiding inquiry, and helping the group make meaning from course materials. And so in our program, we typically rely on really tight application loops. It's research, prototyping, iteration, critique, and then we repeat that process as needed as many times as necessary. And most of our classes are studio and project-based formats. So one of our marketing lines is that we have 0 tests in our program, but a lot of presentations. But as part of building this skill set of being a designer, we also focus on the less tangible aspects of design practice. So that's what it means to be a thoughtful, critical, and effective professional in your work. So while we are what the university designates a professional degree, and we focus on training practitioners, the motivating question for today, as we talk about student-led seminars, is what happens in a course where the, quote, project is developing a point of view and a philosophy of practice rather than building something physical. Our students build a lot of things. They build lamps, apps, business plans, plywood, shade pavilions, whatever is needed that semester. But they also build a philosophy around their own practice as designers. And I think this idea of building a philosophy around your own ideology in ethical framework is key for all of our students. But about halfway through every class in our program, I get to introduce my personal favorite metaphor. It's the best one I have ever come up with, ever in my life. And it's the one that grosses out the students the most. This is when we talk about the goo. The goo is shorthand for the ambiguous middle stage of a project where students are rebuilding how they think. In this metaphor, a caterpillar builds a chrysalis, is obscured from the world, and then emerges as something completely different, a beautiful butterfly. But inside the chrysalis, it essentially disintegrates. It becomes this literal pile of goo, fully deconstructed and then constructed into something that is completely new. And so for these students, this is where their prior confidence dissolves and a new structure begins forming. And it is pretty sticky and pretty gross, but it's also necessary for growth. And so the question becomes, how do we guide the goo, and how might we traverse ambiguity without totally removing it? We want our students to be okay living in the discomfort of ambiguity from time to time, while also recognizing that it still has to be navigated. It has to be navigated through. So today I want to talk about a class where student-led seminars have been particularly effective. This is one of our core MADI courses. It's called The Context and Impact of Design. And while most of our classes are around more tactical skill building, this class covers design history, ethics, and practice across design disciplines. It's focused on identifying the recurrent threads between intention and outcome that persist across design specializations, and building up this sort of lens of responsibility around the potential impact of the things that we are making. Because we are a practitioner-oriented degree, everything that we teach needs to be applicable to a student's personal and professional development. So over the course of this semester, the students are prompted to ask and continue to reevaluate, how does my new understanding of how design is operated historically shape the kind of practitioner that I want to become? So this class has the most reading by far in our program. Lots of readings, lots of documentaries, lots of podcasts. Some past students have called it movie class, which I'm like, I'll take that as a compliment. But the weekly themes that the students are exposed to are intentionally loose. They aren't necessarily divided by specialization. There isn't architecture week followed by urban design week and graphic design week, anything like that. I tend to group all of these materials strategically, but somewhat abstractly. And I'm less interested in students having rote knowledge of the text at the end, and I'm more interested in what they identify in those liminal spaces between the texts. Since, as we know, those spaces are where interpretive work begins to happen. And then historically, I've designed response papers based on that week's material. It's been a useful exercise, or it was a useful exercise in the beginning, but this is the one thing I'm going to say about AI, just to be part of the club. But over the last 2 years, especially as AI has become, more ingrained in students' experience, it's become clear that these response papers have become a little bit outmoded, at least for the use that I have been instituting them. And while I don't have a problem with assistive AI in general, or it did unearth something important for me. For these students, becoming a polished academic writer is not a major priority. And I don't really think it needs to be. We only have them for 2 years. They have a specific set of goals coming into our program, and we need to equip them to be the practitioners out in the field. But for many designers, the more urgent skill is being able to think rhetorically in conversation. So that includes speaking clearly, challenging respectfully, and revising positions in real time. And across our program, some of our key growth areas are building these skill areas of judgment, leadership, and then disciplinary voice, and the ability to become subject matter experts within the world that we're training them. So my goal is to allow students to start practicing how the discipline thinks. So how it asks questions, tests claims, challenges assumptions, and iterates positions publicly with confidence. So in our student seminars, we focus on guided inquiry, not open discussion. So open discussion can, as we all know, we've all seen it a million times, but it can often lead to uneven participation and kind of this like taking turns talking dynamic. Whereas more of a guided inquiry gives students the opportunity to build and test their interpretations together, and it helps them practice strategies that they're still learning in real time, and it introduces accountability as the norm. So a productive seminar, at least in my context, stays accountable to the group, to knowledge, and to accepted standards of reasoning. So that's something that we sort of introduce at the beginning of the course, and there's an existing model, it's called accountability talk, that sort of developed these basic tenets. So it's where I sort of learned some of this stuff from. But in the case of the model that I'm presenting today, this particular seminar has 3 sort of major components. First, it has a 5-category structure that gives students reliable, what I call thinking actions, to move their thought and discussions forward. And I'm sure everyone here has heard of design thinking. Everyone here heard of design thinking? Design thinking is related to human-centered design, but they're actually quite different kind of at the core. You can think of design thinking as an accessible entry point to human-centered design. In our program, we prioritize not stopping at the thinking. Design is ultimately the doing and the relating our thinking to our doing. So these, as I present them, are thinking actions or acts of thinking. So the second aspect are rotating roles that distribute leadership and protect equitable participation. And then thirdly, this is actually something I'm trying for the first time this semester, and I'll talk about it a little more in a second, but brief post-seminar notes in class that consolidate learning and build a shared intellectual memory over time. So, of course, instructor or student-led does not mean instructor absent. There is a scaffolding around these student-led seminars that tend to increase their chance of success. So first of all, I meet with each group before they run the seminar. And so this semester, I currently have on the books to have in this class 3 semesters or 3 seminars sort of spread throughout the course. And then I meet with each of those teams prior to the seminar. So that's when we review their outline. We talk about the themes or questions that they plan to prioritize, and then the roles that they'll use to support kind of the flow and preparation or participation. And I ask for a simple run of show. So it doesn't have to be a full script, but basically hold them accountable to preparation around this seminar that they're responsible for. I also ask what other secondary resources, like should there be more assigned readings before these seminars that come from the students that help sort of complement what we have already done. And then we can talk about anything that they as a smaller group are confused about. So kind of the preliminary goo, before they walk into the seminar so they can walk into it with confidence. As far as the seminar requirements, each seminar is required to have chapters, as I call them. So these are distinct segments with a purpose. It could be, this change, depending on the group, but it could be an opening, a synthesis-focused discussion. It could be an activity, could be a closing statement. It could be a skit. No one's ever done a skit, but it could be a skit. Anything like that. Chapters prevent drift and they help the quieter students. This is where I've really seen this be helpful. It helps quieter students anticipate entry points so they can start to sort of prepare where they feel most enabled to enter the conversation. And then thirdly, every student must lead something visible. There's some flexibility around what that means, but in general, they must be a primary facilitator for at least one chapter or one section within that, the seminar. They can share the responsibility. It doesn't have to be one person doing each thing, but each person needs to be in a leadership role within at least one of these chapters. And then lastly, the seminar must include a design aid. So these are designers and design students, so we want them to make something that helps facilitate the seminar. Usually this is something like a deck, like a slide deck, but it could also be a worksheet. It could be an activity that they design or something like that. So these aids externalize thinking and support shared reference points during the discussion that we have. So in the Maddie program, we love our frameworks. This is one of them, the 7 circles. It's proprietary, but you can steal it if you want. This is the HCD funnel developed by Jessica Burnham in the back. So as we're going through these sort of abstract skill building things, we try to introduce these visual ways of thinking about the steps. And so I decided for this to come up with something completely original and never seen before, the upside down pyramid of thinking actions. But these 5 and I'm going to go over them briefly, but these 5 thinking actions are these: clarify through apply. So I do admit that coming into an environment like this, I was a little nervous that I was accidentally stealing someone's idea. So I Googled it, and first time I've ever been that Google AI has referenced something I made for that. So I think that's a win. Put it in my CV. But these 5 sort of thinking actions are not a rigid sequence. And this is something I introduced at the very first day of a class. We don't just use them for the seminars, we use them throughout the course and sort of hopefully beyond. But they aren't meant to be a rigid sequence. They do work well sequentially, and perhaps that's the most natural way to sort of get students used to thinking in these ways, but they're meant to be used as appropriate within the conversational structure of a seminar or of a class, or even of something like office hours, these one-on-one conversations. We come back to these. So I'm going to briefly cover each of these at a very high level. So clarify is where we sort of build shared meaning. This is where we talk about, once again, a lot of these students, they're they have professional goals, but they're coming a lot of times back into an academic environment after time in the field of some kind. So they're kind of getting used to this academic way of thinking again. But this is where we define terms, we locate claims. This is where we surface assumptions and then usually just squash those assumptions immediately. And we sort of get back in that habit of normalizing revoicing. So, this idea of, so what I hear you saying is, this idea of sort of validating understanding. This is something that clarifying, obviously, we drift into as a phase regularly throughout the entire course. So the second one is synthesize. So we build shared intellectual memories is how we talk about it. And I've heard this sort of practice, this area referred to as an anti-amnesia device. So if we visit this, and this is a good example of a conversation that we come back to almost every single class in one way or another, because it helps us, it prevents each week from resetting to zero whenever we're talking about synthesis. It's where they develop their disciplinary meaning-making habits and where they sort of start to connect those ideas across reading. So it's where they sort of inhabit that liminal space that we talked about. So challenge. This is often the hardest stage, as we all know. This is where we sort of make claims, earn confidence, where we talk about evidence. So in our program, we focus a lot. This is probably Jessica's catchphrase, where's the evidence? That's what we hear a lot. And then how do you know? To agree that many of our students find frustrating. They find very frustrating. They have so much evidence. But it's easy and common for people to think of design as an aesthetic or a taste-oriented exercise, but within human-centered design, that is not the case. So challenge has two common failure modes that we all know. Either no one challenges because it feels rude, which is common with our students who tend to be pretty empathetic people, or challenge becomes kind of this debate performance. But we try to introduce rhetorical tools that can soften that challenge without weakening rigor. So there's oops, oh my goodness, what did I just do? What did I do? Present. All right, cool. So I'll just keep on going. I know I only have a couple minutes left. All right. So reframing, I think of this as kind of the twin of challenge. So I have twins. They're identical, and if you have twins or know any, you know that the relationship is both beautiful and fraught. So they're hopelessly entangled, but also strive to individualize themselves, right? And so similarly, reframing is a parallel partner to challenging. This is where we change the lens to reveal blind spots. We ask questions constantly. Who is telling the story? What do they want you to believe? What values are presented as positive or neutral? This is a big one in design. And then who is absent or obscured? And this is where you can also start to bring in some of these other external frameworks that are in the broader world, especially kind of in the business world a little bit. This is one we use. We oftentimes ask our students to frame their question through each of these lenses as best as they can, and then we talk through that. It's like, why did they make those decisions, and how do they know that their interpretation has validity? This can feel really unnatural at first for a lot of students, but it helps students hear what operate beneath explicit claims. It also encourages revising positions publicly without feeling nervous or ashamed, because here, looking through these lenses, revision is treated as a strength. And then lastly is apply. I know I just have a minute or so left. But as I mentioned before, everything we teach needs to come back to the students' growth as practicing designers. And so application, in discussion of application and constant evaluation of application, keeps the seminar from becoming just kind of a tour of ideas. It connects to the course's purpose. Students are building a practitioner's ethical lens and framework. They're not only interpreting theory in the class. And then we always come back to this question of how knowledge can be processed and applied. And it also just reinforces our program stance that scholarship is a tool for seeing and for questioning. It's not merely material that needs to be memorized. And then lastly, new this semester, I'm going to integrate. We'll see if this works. Once again, it's always a prototype. Everything's a prototype. But I'm going to integrate what I'm currently calling post-seminar notes. Up to this point, as I mentioned, students have written those weekly response papers based on the assigned material, but I want to replace those with brief end-of-seminar writing exercises that are meant to be interpretive in the moment. Not polished pieces of writing. I want them to take a snapshot of where they are at the moment after those seminars conclude, with the purpose of consolidating learning, building continuity, and then over time creating a sort of cumulative shared memory, especially as they share those reflections with their fellow students. These are just a few, sort of quick prompts that might be relevant. But ideally, this exercise will reinforce that knowledge building is cumulative, communal, and revisable. What students believe now is going to change over time as they learn more and go through that synthesis process again and again. So being comfortable with that idea of change over time and your perspective changing over time is an important skill as both a designer and a design leader. And lastly, while this is a student-led seminar, don't worry, it's also still instructor-led. I'm just leading the class differently, right? So this approach, and this is what I've seen a lot of benefit from this and gotten a lot of feedback, positive feedback on this, is that this approach lets me move from the front of the room into the seats. So I go sit with the students during the seminar. And I become a participant in the conversation. So if students do get stuck, they don't have to panic. My role is to sort of gently guide conversations where appropriate, reinforce structure where it's needed in the midst of the seminar, and then help the students build confidence while enabling them to maintain ownership over the experience as a whole in a way that recognizes that they're still learning to do these things. So they know I'm there to support them, but they also know my expectation is that they are going to be prepared and that they are going to lead well. So just to sort of sum everything up with a nice little concluding statement, in my experience, student-led seminars work when discussion is treated as a method. Guided inquiry supported by shared intention, distributed roles, and cumulative reflection that builds shared intellectual memory over time. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. This is pretty cool. And this is something I kind of do in my classes already. Some questions I have for students who say they are, have shared with me they're more introverted and, the idea of public speaking is kind of terrifying. How do you coach them through that?
So that's a great question. So within the context of our program, we put a lot of, now I will also, I should clarify, not only Maddie students aren't the only grad students who take this class, and I've actually had a lot of undergrads take this class as well. So I think that if they're a Maddie student, they are presenting every single week for 2 years, and so that's a big priority, is building that confidence from a pedagogical standpoint. Whereas students who might not have that sort of level of exposure coming into the class, that's where I, as an instructor, can, and that's part of why I have those pre-seminar meetings, is it does allow me to give a little bit of flexibility and kind of real-time calls on, okay, so if you don't want to be up there leading necessarily, then what else, how else can you contribute? So could you take notes? Could you be the, somebody who's going to report out to the team or to me at the end? Are you somebody who maybe is the person who's making the deck? Like things like that. So I think that there are ways that we can navigate that sort of leadership and equitable participation that are based more on the production side versus the speaking side. That's kind of how I've navigated it in the past.
I'm just wondering if you can give us specific examples of topics that or projects that you remember, like stories that you can tell us a little bit about, like using this method.
Sure. So trying to think of a specific one. I think part of the it's interesting seeing which, because the way that I, present it, I recognize that this is a very individual class with an individual sort of set of, of topics we're diving into. But there tends to be, from each week, one sort of major thing that sticks out to everybody in the group that they've never really considered. So an example might be sidewalks. Let's pick sidewalks. We might talk about, I might give some readings about how sidewalk width affects somebody's ability to move through space, right? And then sort of contrast that with elevators, and how that affects people, the ability to move through space. But I don't overtly talk about that. I talk about, like, here are these different sort of areas of experience around accessibility, for example. And almost every single time, whenever that's kind of in my head a major focus that we're talking on, that's what they bring up. They're like, we want to talk about this revelation that we've had that has to do with the way that we design space has a profound effect on how people move through space, and their attention, and all this kind of stuff. And then before we do that, those readings, the week before, I take them all to North Park Mall for class. And then I basically have them do a visual analysis of the experience of moving through the mall and sort of talk about, like, how does the width of a corridor matched with this piece of art and then this huge thing that's trying to sell me something? Like, what is that? What is kind of, how does that experience impact my impression, And so I think going through those practical exercises first then really influences how they, like, start to pull things out of those texts in a way that, and then that ends up being, like, the major focus of a seminar.